Hello, my name is Andrew Cook. I'm the editor of Family Tree Magazine, and this is From Sea to Shining Sea: How to Research in Every U.S. State. If you're like me, you have ancestors not just from the state that you live in currently, but also other states around the country. And with how decentralized record keeping was in the United States, researching in different states can be a little bit like researching in different countries. I've worked on dozens of state-specific research guides during my time with Family Tree Magazine, and that's helped me learn some different commonalities in how to research in these different states. And so today I'm going to walk you through what you need to know when you're researching in a new to you state. We'll start by walking through 5 questions that you should ask yourself when researching in a new state, and then we will transition over into some general research notes about different regions of the country. The first question to ask yourself is, when did this state achieve statehood? And the first piece of this is, when did your ancestors' state become part of the United States? This map here from the National Atlas of the United States includes different colors that indicate major land acquisition events that occurred throughout US history, starting with the Treaty of Paris in 1783, which you can think of as the kind of starting point for the starting borders for the newly independent United States. That's everything in tan there, east of the Mississippi River. Then, of course, there's the Louisiana Purchase in 1803 that doubled the United States' size, there in white. There were 2 treaties with Great Britain, one in 1818 and one in 1846, that helped clarify the US's northern border with Canada and ultimately resulted in the US coming into ownership of the Oregon Territory. The Mexican Cession of 1848 and the subsequent Gadsden Purchase that added a lot of the American Southwest to the United States at the end of the Mexican-American War, and then a handful of other acquisitions, notably the annexation of the Republic of Texas, that's that teal color there, in 1845, the purchase of Alaska from Russia in 1867, and then the acquisition of Florida and some of the other Gulf Shore areas from Spain in 1819. So there's the question of when a state became part, when the land became part of the United States, but then also what the US did with it once it had it. Many, but not all, states were first organized as territories, and it's important to note that a state may have been part of a territory of a different name before becoming a territory or a state in its own right. For example, Minnesota had previously been part of Missouri, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Iowa territories. So if you were researching an ancestor who lived in Minnesota during that territorial era, you might be looking for records under a different state's name. U.S. history is often taught as a series of westward expansions from the Atlantic to the Pacific, but there are a lot of factors that complicate that, and you can kind of see that in this map of years of statehood, with the different colors representing different, not quite decades, but different sort of regions of time. There are a lot of things that you need to consider that sort of complicate that very simple way of thinking about history. First, of course, is the thousands of years of Native American settlement throughout much of what is now the United States. There's also the matter of the European powers that colonized the United States besides just Britain. For example, Spain was active in New Mexico from the early 1600s, founding Santa Fe in 1610. That predates the Pilgrims landing at Plymouth by 10 years. So if you were looking just at that 1912 statehood year for New Mexico, you might not realize that. You also need to think about topography, as the geography of a region absolutely made a difference in how easily and quickly it was settled. The Mountain West, for example, was settled relatively late because of how difficult it was to get to, its remoteness and its perceived lack of agricultural value. But as we'll talk about, that changed in the mid and late 1800s with the discovery of gold and silver in different parts of the Rocky Mountain area. And finally, migration routes, with communities seeking out new areas for different reasons and not uniformly so. So you'll see in this map that California and Oregon became states well before their neighbors. They're in green there, where their neighbors are in blue. And that's largely because of interest in those areas from the Oregon Trail, the famous Oregon Trail, and the gold rush of 1848, 1849 in California. The next question to ask yourself is, when did the state begin keeping vital records, those crucial records of births, marriages, and deaths, unlike in, say, the United Kingdom, where the national government was tasked with civil registration? This was left to the individual states, most of whom didn't adopt mandates for vital records until well into the 20th century, with most states somewhere between the 1880s and the late 1910s. Unfortunately, even after these laws were passed, the compliance may have been spotty, so it's not unusual for you to see haphazard maybe is too strong of a word, but inconsistent vital record keeping in some states even into the 1930s. Fortunately, individual counties often kept records before they were required to by the state, particularly of marriages, which may have been documented from the county's first settlement. Generally, there are 3 different ways that you can access these records today. The first, and probably most accessible to most people, is on third-party websites, especially Family Search, but also Ancestry and MyHeritage, with state archives or other government entities making agreements with these websites that in which they provide the records and the companies digitize them, index them, make them available. Sometimes only under certain restrictions. For example, some records at Family Search can only be viewed at a Family Search Center or at the Family History Library in Salt Lake City. Another option would be the archive or library, or a cooperation between different libraries and archives, host their own database on a website. These can be somewhat trickier to navigate since they're not always laid out for genealogists, but the example I have here is the Georgia Archives Virtual Vault, which has a collection of death certificates for that state. And finally, of course, you can request the records yourself or through a service like VitalCheck. And in the next slide, we'll get into some of the different rules about that, but you can ask someone at the archives to look up your ancestor's record and send it to you either via mail or via email. The third question is, what privacy restrictions are there for vital records? Most states have protections around recent records that keep them from being accessible to anyone but the people named in them, their direct descendants, or parties with a compelling legal interest. This, as with a lot of things when it comes to state research, it varies quite a bit from state to state, and it can change based on what's going on in the state legislature. But generally speaking, birth records that are less than 100 years old are protected, as are marriage records less than 50 years old, and death records less than 25 or 50 years old. You're probably watching this presentation in 2025, so if a state of interest had a 100-year vital record or birth record law, you wouldn't be able to see any vital records created after 1925 if you were not one of those eligible classes of people. And here, this is sort of a visualization of these different dates that you need to keep in mind: the date of first settlement, the date when vital records were first required, and then, of course, the present day, because whether the records exist will be impacted by this information, as well as where the records live today and if you are able to have access to them. So records of birth, marriage, and death that were created before statewide registration were kept somewhat sporadically by the individual county, often held today by the courthouse or the state archive, whereas post-statewide registration records were kept more or less consistently by the state and are held today by the Vital Records Office, which is usually a division of the State Department of Health. And that lock and that line there are a reminder that many states have privacy laws that restrict access to records for a certain amount of time. It's possible, as a result, that For example, in New Mexico, where vital records were not taken until 1920, maybe some counties lagged in even after registration. So there might not be a record for your ancestor who lived in or who was born in 1926, say. And even if it does exist, you might not be able to access the record because it's within that 100-year time frame. Moving on to other kinds of records, our fourth question to ask yourself is, did the state take any of its own censuses? Genealogists make use first, of course, of the federal census that was taken every 10 years, and it is important to think about when your ancestors' community would have first appeared in the federal census. But many states took their own counts as well, and that can provide a helpful supplement, a helpful complement to these federal counts. Some states took them every 10 years on the fives, so 1875, 1885, and so on, while other states didn't take any censuses of their own, unfortunately. Or they did take them, but they haven't survived, or they don't have genealogically useful details in them. State censuses are usually held by state archives, and like vital records, they're often made available through third-party sites or collections created by the archives themselves. This sample record here is an 1885 state census from Iowa, for example, that's on Family Search. And Family Tree Magazine has a searchable table of available state censuses on our website, and you can grab a link to that in the syllabus. Finally, rounding out our records overview is the question, was the state a public land state or a state land state? And these divisions are important because they affect where you can get the land records today. Public land states are those in which land was distributed by the federal government through programs like the Homestead Act, and patents are held by the Bureau of Land Management's General Land Office, and there's the link to that organization there. However, in state land states, land was distributed either by the state government or by the relevant colonial government of the era and of the area. Today, these are held by the relevant state archive. I've got a chart here that lists out the public land states versus the state land states. One go-by is that state land states are the 13 colonies, the 13 original colonies, plus the states that were created out of them. So the 13 plus Kentucky, Tennessee, West Virginia, and Maine. And then, in addition to all of those, the other state land states are independent republics that were absorbed into the United States, namely Texas, Vermont, and Hawaii. And then public land states are all the rest. Another possible go-by is most public land states are to the west of the Mississippi. Most state land states are to the east, although there are exceptions. Regardless of whether your ancestor lived in a public land state or a state land state, anything after that initial transaction, for example, transactions between two individuals, is going to be recorded in deeds that were created by the county and held today by the county courthouse, or the county clerk's office. I obviously I don't have time here to talk about each of the 50 states plus Puerto Rico and Washington, D.C., but we can make some generalizations about each region based on their shared history, their cultures, how they came into the United States, and general trends and how they were settled. So we'll work through each of these different regions in turn briefly, and you'll find more detail in the syllabus. Starting off with New England, which is the home base of us here at Family Tree Magazine. These New England towns were largely settled by English refugees, religious refugees, who kept very good vital records from early on, even the mid-1600s. So knowing the town in New England is especially important. In addition to those English settlers, New England also has a large Irish population, as well as French Canadians from across the border there in Canada. Moving down south a bit to the mid-Atlantic, these colonies, New York, Pennsylvania, Delaware, were all in New Jersey, were all part of the former New Netherland colony, which hints a little bit at their more cosmopolitan makeup, with their large cities being immigration centers for people from around the world, but especially the Netherlands, Ireland, Italy, Eastern Europe, and particularly in New York in the last few decades, the Caribbean as well. That stands in contrast to these two regions, the Great Lakes and the South, which tend to be more rural, with notable exceptions including cities like Chicago, Atlanta, Charleston, um, which all had historic importance. In the South, all of the states in red here, except for Kentucky and West Virginia, seceded from the Union to form the Confederate States of America during the Civil War. Obviously, slavery was an important part of their economy, and partially as a result of the Civil War, but also as a result of uh, county courthouse fires and a general reluctance to keep some vital records. These states are among the latest to start keeping marriage records, for example. You tend to see larger gaps in record availability in the South than you do in other parts of the country. Also, partially as a legacy of that the history of slavery, you have a large Black population, particularly in the Black Belt states of Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and South Carolina. Moving across the river north here into Ohio, which is my home state, in the Great Lakes region, this territory, the western pieces of it were part of the Louisiana Territory, while the lands east of the Mississippi River were part of the original United States and organized as the Northwest Territory, which was sort of the first frontier after independence. The waterways were especially important in this part of the country. Early French settlers traveled up the Missouri and Mississippi and Ohio rivers and founded trading posts, and the arrival of the riverboat, for example, and the completion of canals in different parts of the country were a real boom to this part of the country, to these states. These were some of the first to have their land distributed by the federal government, harkening back to that public state versus state land state conversation a few slides ago. And notable immigrant groups here include Germans, Scandinavians, and Eastern Europeans. Moving now into America's heartland, we have the Midwest. The states highlighted in pink here were all part of the Louisiana Purchase, and were not necessarily settled as quickly as the Great Lakes region or as the Pacific coast, but it was really the arrival of railroads and riverboats that increased interest in this area, as well as the passage of the Homestead Act in 1862 that opened up a lot of opportunities for new settlement. Notable immigrant groups here, especially in the Dakotas, include the Scandinavians and Germans. In the Southwest, we have a very deep and older history. I mentioned Santa Fe earlier. That early Spanish settlement led to an older history here than in some other parts of the country. In addition, Texas was an independent republic before being admitted to the United States, and Oklahoma was set aside as Indian Territory. Arizona, New Mexico, and Oklahoma were all admitted to the Union relatively late, which means they all also kept civil records later than other places in the country. Fortunately, though, Spanish and Mexican Catholic Church records go back quite a ways, so that can be a useful substitute. As a result of that Spanish history, the proximity to Mexico, the Southwest has a large Spanish-speaking population, and even to this day has a large Native American population with large reservations in this area, and that's sort of a vestige of the Trail of Tears and the displacement of Native American peoples from other parts of the country. Finally, we have the Mountain West and the Pacific Coast. The Mountain West lands were acquired either through the Louisiana Purchase or the Mexican Cession, and are notable for their harsh terrain. As I mentioned earlier, topography makes a big difference here in how late some of these areas were settled compared to their neighbors. However, railroads and the discovery of gold and silver created land rushes in some of these towns that resulted in kind of an odd demographic situation where you would have boom towns and then ghost towns, and then eventually wider settlement. Other notable groups that came through here include the members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, who followed the Mormon Trail from the Midwest, and founded their own settlement in Salt Lake City, which, of course, today is sort of the capital of U.S. genealogy. The Pacific Coast, we've talked about a little bit in, I guess, a couple different ways, but there was a lot of interest in movement here earlier than in its neighbors because in Oregon, the Oregon Trail, the Willamette Valley, and in California, because of gold rushes, the land came to the United States via the Mexican Cession in terms of California, and Washington and Oregon were both part of the Oregon Country acquired from Great Britain in 1846. Rounding out the region, Alaska was purchased in 1867 and Hawaii annexed in 1898. Even today, this region has a large Latino and Asian population because of its proximity to Mexico, but also the prominence of ports like San Francisco in receiving immigrants from Japan, China, the Philippines, other places out west, with the San Francisco's Angel Island being known as the Ellis Island of the West. So I know we've covered a lot of ground, and we can only get into so much detail here in the amount of time we have. So I wanted to share these other resources. As I mentioned, Family Tree Magazine publishes dedicated guides to each U.S. state and as well as the territories of Puerto Rico and Washington, D.C. Each is 4 pages long, covers when records begin for each place. There's a timeline of important historical events and notes about records access. We publish 2 of these in each issue of Family Tree Magazine, but you can also buy them in digital format through the link there, either individually or as a bundle for a discount. There are 2 other books that I find especially useful. There's The Source and Red Book. These are 2 long-published, well-respected titles that cover how to do research. The Source covers general U.S. research, whereas the Red Book goes into individual states, not unlike our research guides. They were both published. Their most recent edition for both of them is from the mid-2000s, so they are a little bit out of date in terms of record access, but they still lay some really valuable groundwork. And finally, the Family Search Wiki is a really great resource. They have individual pages for each state, as well as even for each record type, including links to record collections, both at Family Search and at other websites. Here's my contact information. I hope that you have a newfound appreciation for what it takes to research in new U.S. states, as well as some new things to try and some new questions to ask yourself as you move about the country. Thanks so much for watching, and enjoy the rest of your RootsTech experience.